wind screaming across the Siberian taiga at 60 below zero drowns out almost everything. But it couldn't drown out the heavy, desperate thud against Ruth Caldwell's cabin door. When she opened it, she didn't find a lost traveler. She found 400 pounds of apex predator, begging for mercy. Oymyakon, Siberia, is widely recognized as the coldest permanently inhabited settlement on Earth. Here, the winter air is so frigid that human breath turns into ice crystals that fall to the ground with a sound locals call the whisper of the stars. For 72-year-old Ruth Caldwell, an American-born retired wildlife biologist who had spent the last 40 years studying the taiga's fragile ecosystem, this brutal isolation was home. She lived alone in a fortified log cabin on the extreme outskirts of the village, surrounded by hundreds of miles of unbroken, snow-choked pine forest. It was mid-January, and the mercury had plummeted to a staggering -68 degrees Fahrenheit. A whiteout blizzard was tearing through the valley, rattling the heavy storm shutters of Ruth's cabin. Inside, a cast-iron wood stove radiated a steady, life-saving heat. Ruth was seated by the fire, mending a pair of heavy wool mittens, when the sound first cut through the howling wind. Thump! It was low and heavy, vibrating through the thick wooden floorboards. Ruth paused, her needle hovering. The wind often played tricks, throwing heavy branches against the roof. But this was different. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Thump, scratch, thump. Something was at her front door. Her mind raced through the possibilities. A lost hunter? A neighbor whose snowmobile had broken down? Or something wild? Bears were deep in hibernation, but the taiga hid other ghosts. Ruth set her sewing aside and moved to the heavy oak door. She didn't call out. Any sound would be swallowed by the gale outside. Instead, she reached for the Winchester. 30-06 rifle she kept mounted on the wall above the coat rack. Living on the edge of the wilderness meant you never answered a late-night knock empty-handed. She chambered around with a sharp, metallic clack that felt abnormally loud in the quiet cabin. Pulling back the heavy deadbolt, she cracked the door open just a few inches, keeping her foot firmly wedged behind it. The blast of cold air that hit her face was physically painful, stealing the breath from her lungs. But it wasn't the cold that made Ruth's heart slam against her ribs. Crouching on her snow-swept porch was a fully grown Amur tiger. Ruth froze, her grip on the rifle tightening until her knuckles turned white. The sheer size of the animal was incomprehensible up close. It was a female, easily weighing 400 pounds, her thick orange and black coat heavily matted with ice and snow. The tiger's massive head was lowered, her amber eyes locked onto Ruth's face. There was no aggression in her posture, no flattened ears, no bared fangs. Instead, there was an unnatural stillness. The tiger was panting, her hot breath sending plumes of steam into the freezing air, her ribs visible beneath her winter coat. She was starving, but she wasn't hunting. The mother tiger slowly lowered her massive jaws and deposited a bundle at Ruth's snow-covered boots. It was a cub, no larger than a medium-sized dog, lying entirely limp. The snow around the cub immediately began to stain a dark, steaming crimson. Ruth stopped breathing. She was a scientist. She knew the unwritten rules of the wild. An apex predator does not seek out a human unless driven by an absolute, terrifying desperation. The mother tiger took one slow step backward, her gaze shifting from Ruth to the bleeding cub, and then back to Ruth. She let out a low, vibrating chuff, a sound of greeting, of submission. She's asking for help, Ruth realized, a chill running down her spine that had nothing to do with the open door. The maternal instinct transcended species. The tiger knew her cub was dying, and she knew she could not save it. The wilderness had pushed her to the absolute brink, forcing her to cross the ultimate boundary and seek out the only creature capable of altering their fate. "Okay," Ruth whispered, her voice trembling. "Okay." She slowly lowered the barrel of the Winchester. Never taking her eyes off the mother, Ruth reached down with her left hand. Her thick leather glove grasped the scruff of the cub's neck. The little tiger let out a weak, pitiful squeak but didn't fight. Ruth hauled the heavy, bleeding animal over the threshold and onto the cabin floorboards. The mother tiger did not try to follow. She simply watched as Ruth dragged her offspring inside. As Ruth pushed the heavy oak door shut against the blizzard, the last thing she saw was the mother tiger curling her massive body onto the frozen planks of the porch, turning herself into a living, breathing barricade against the storm. She was going to wait. Inside the cabin, the reality of the situation hit Ruth with the force of a freight train. She had a dying tiger cub bleeding out on her kitchen floor, and a 400-pound mother waiting on her porch. Ruth heaved the cub onto her heavy wooden dining table, sweeping aside a lantern and a stack of books. The cub was a male, perhaps 5 months old, K within 2.6. He was shivering violently, slipping in and out of consciousness. Ruth grabbed a pair of heavy trauma shears from her emergency medical kit and began cutting away the matted, blood-soaked fur on his right hind leg. When she saw the wound, she let out a harsh curse. It was a snare. A thick, braided steel cable was wrapped savagely around the cub's upper thigh. The more the cub had struggled, the tighter the noose had drawn. It had sliced through the skin and deep into the muscle, scraping against the femur. The surrounding tissue was swollen, blackened, and necrotic. Gangrene was setting in. If the blood loss didn't kill him, the infection certainly would. Ruth's hands shook. She was a biologist, not a surgeon. She knew how to track these animals, how to tranquilize them for tagging, but this required delicate, life-saving intervention. She needed help. She sprinted to her desk and grabbed her satellite phone. She dialed the only person within a 500-mile radius who might know what to do, Dr. Samuel Bennett. Samuel was a former military veterinarian from Chicago who had set up a remote wildlife clinic in the neighboring outpost town of Tomtor. The phone clicked and hissed with static before Samuel's gruff voice broke through. "Ruth, it's 2 a.m. Is your generator down again?" "Samuel." "Listen to me carefully," Ruth said, her voice tight but remarkably steady. "I need you to talk me through a snare removal and wound debridement. Right now." "A snare? On what? Did a sled dog get loose?" "Not a dog, Samuel. An Amur tiger cub. The mother brought it to my door. She's sitting on my porch." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. "Ruth, tell me you are joking. If you have a wild tiger in your cabin—" "I am not joking, Samuel," Ruth barked, grabbing a bottle of high-proof Russian vodka and a medical tray. "The snare is deep. It's a braided steel wire, embedded down to the bone. The tissue is necrotic. How do I get it off without severing the femoral artery?" Samuel's tone instantly shifted from disbelief to absolute, clinical focus. Okay, Ruth. Do you have bolt cutters?" "I have heavy-duty wire snips. That'll have to do. You need to sterilize them, boil water, or use alcohol. Do you have any anesthetics? Ketamine? Xylazine?" "I have a vial of xylazine left over from a tagging expedition 3 years ago. I don't know if it's still good. Use it. Calculate the dose for a 60-pound animal. Inject it intramuscularly into the healthy leg. You cannot let that cub wake up while you are cutting that wire, or it will thrash and tear the artery itself." Ruth clamped the phone between her ear and shoulder. She drew the anesthetic into a syringe, her hands moving with practiced, mechanical efficiency. She found a patch of healthy muscle on the cub's left shoulder and plunged the needle in. Within minutes, the cub's violent shivering slowed, and his breathing became deep and rhythmic. "He's under," Ruth said, pouring a generous amount of vodka over the wire snips and her own hands. "All right, Ruth, you need to find the locking mechanism of the snare. Don't try to pull the wire. You have to cut it at the thickest part of the loop, right where it meets the knot. Go slow. If you see pulsating bright red blood, stop immediately." Ruth leaned over the table. The smell of copper and infection was overpowering. She wedged the nose of the wire snips beneath the steel cable, pressing into the raw, ruined muscle. The cub twitched, a low moan escaping his throat. Ruth held her breath and squeezed the handles of the snips with all her remaining strength. Snap! The steel cable popped, flying backward. The immediate release of pressure caused a fresh wave of dark venous blood to well up. But it wasn't the rhythmic spurting of a ruptured artery. "I got it," Ruth gasped, pulling the bloody snare free and tossing it clattering onto the floor. "The artery is intact. Good. Now, flush the wound. Flush it until you run out of saline or water. Pack it with whatever antibiotics you have. Bind it tight." And Samuel was suddenly cut off, not by static, but by a sound from outside that made the blood freeze in Ruth's veins. It was a roar, but it wasn't the desperate, submissive chuff the mother tiger had made earlier. This was a guttural, earth-shaking bellow of pure, unadulterated rage. It rattled the window panes and sent a shockwave through the cabin floor. "Ruth." Samuel's voice crackled frantically through the phone. "Ruth, what was that?" Ruth slowly lowered the phone to the table. She picked up her rifle, walking silently toward the frosted front window. She wiped a small circle of condensation away from the glass and peered out into the howling blizzard. Through the swirling snow, she saw the mother tiger. The massive beast was no longer curled up defensively. She was standing at the edge of the porch, her back arched, every muscle in her body coiled tight as a spring. Her fangs were bared, a terrifying display of lethal weaponry. She was staring out into the tree line. Ruth squinted, trying to see through the whiteout. Then, she saw it. Two sweeping beams of yellow light cut through the falling snow, illuminating the dark trunks of the pines. Headlights. An off-road vehicle was grinding its way up her isolated driveway. As the vehicle killed its engine, the headlights remained on, casting long, eerie shadows across the snow. Two figures stepped out of the truck, silhouetted against the bright beams. They were heavily bundled in winter gear, and both were carrying long-barreled rifles. Ruth's breath hitched. These weren't lost travelers. And they weren't local wildlife authorities. The snare on the cub's leg was a custom job, heavy, illegal, designed to trap and hold large predators without killing them immediately, preserving the pelt. The men walking toward her cabin were the poachers who had set the trap. They had followed the blood trail of the cub through the storm, directly to her doorstep. Outside, the mother tiger let out another deafening roar, stepping off the porch and sinking chest deep into the snow, placing herself directly between the poacher's truck and the cabin door. She was heavily outgunned, starving, and freezing, but she was going to fight to the death. "Ruth," Samuel's voice yelled from the phone left on the table. "What is happening?" Ruth didn't answer him. She racked the bolt of her Winchester, chambering a fresh round. She had a choice to make, and she had to make it fast. Ruth did not have the luxury of fear. She had spent 4 decades studying the brutal calculus of the Siberian wilderness, where hesitation was invariably fatal. The two men advancing up her driveway were not bound by the natural laws of the taiga. They were driven by the human sickness of greed. On the black market, an intact adult Amur tiger pelt and its bones could fetch upwards of $200,000. A live cub was worth even more to the exotic pet trade. These men had not braved a -68-degree blizzard by accident. They were here to collect their prize. Ruth grabbed a heavy, fur-lined parka from the coat rack, threw it over her shoulders, and killed the main lantern in the kitchen, plunging the cabin into darkness. Darkness was her only tactical advantage. She quietly unlatched the heavy storm shutter of the front window, creating a 2-inch gap that gave her a clear line of sight to the porch and the driveway. Outside, the mother tiger was a terrifying silhouette against the sweeping yellow beams of the poacher's truck. She let out another thunderous roar, a sound that resonated in Ruth's chest cavity, warning the intruders to step back. "Look at the size of her, Cole." A voice drifted over the howling wind, harsh and metallic. The man on the left, a tall figure bundled in military-grade Arctic gear, raised his rifle. "She's defending the cabin. The cub must be inside." The second man, Cole, laughed a cruel, breathless sound. "2 for the price of 1, Noah. Drop the mother. I'll kick the door in and grab the little one." Noah braced his weapon against his shoulder, centering his optic on the mother tiger's broad chest. Ruth didn't shout a warning. She knew that in the roar of the wind, her voice would be lost, and a verbal threat would only give away her position. Instead, she slipped the barrel of her Winchester. 30-06 through the crack in the window, aimed a foot to the left of Noah, and pulled the trigger. The heavy rifle went off in the confined space of the cabin with a deafening crack, the muzzle flash illuminating the dark room for a split second. Outside, the high-caliber bullet struck the frozen engine block of the poacher's idling off-road vehicle. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The bullet punched through the reinforced steel and shattered the radiator casing. A massive geyser of boiling coolant erupted into the freezing air, instantly turning into a thick, blinding cloud of white steam. The truck's engine shrieked, ground gears, and then choked out, plunging the driveway into near-total darkness as the headlights flickered and died. "Sniper!" Cole screamed, dropping to his knees in the deep snow and raising his rifle blindly toward the cabin. She shot the rig. Ruth racked the bolt, the empty brass casing clinking against the wooden floorboards, and chambered another round. She moved to the secondary window on the left side of the door. "Drop your weapons," Ruth shouted, her voice finally tearing through the sudden silence left by the dead engine. "The next round goes through center mass. You are trespassing on sovereign research territory." Noah, crouching behind the steaming wreckage of the truck, spat a curse into the snow. "You just signed your own death warrant, old woman. Do you have any idea how far you are from help? You just killed our heat. Now we have to take your cabin." It was the terrifying truth of Siberia. Without a running vehicle, the extreme cold was a ticking clock. At -68 degrees Fahrenheit, exposed skin suffers frostbite in less than 3 minutes. Core body temperature drops fatally within the hour. Ruth hadn't just disabled their transport, she had forced a siege. They had to breach her cabin to survive. Suddenly, the mother tiger made her move. Using the cloud of freezing steam as cover, the massive cat launched herself off the porch. She didn't attack directly. An apex predator knows better than to charge headlong into gunfire. Instead, she bounded sideways into the dense, snow-laden pines, her white and orange coat instantly vanishing into the blizzard. Where did she go? Cole panicked, tracking his rifle barrel wildly across the tree line. "Noah, I lost visual. She's in the trees." "Forget the cat. Suppress the cabin," Noah ordered. Both men opened fire. High-velocity rounds tore through the air, splintering the heavy oak logs of Ruth's cabin and shattering the remaining glass in the front window. Ruth threw herself to the floor, covering her head as shards of glass and splinters of wood rained down on her. From the kitchen table, the sedated cub let out a weak, frightened yelp. "Stay down, little one," Ruth whispered, crawling on her belly toward the heavy iron wood stove. She needed to return fire, but she also knew the structural integrity of her cabin. The logs were thick, packed with insulating mud and mortar capable of stopping small arms fire. But the door was the weak point. Before Ruth could maneuver for a clean shot, a blood-curdling scream echoed from the tree line. It wasn't a roar. It was a human scream. Ruth crawled to the window and peered over the sill. In the dim moonlight filtering through the storm, she saw a chaotic struggle in the deep snow 50 yards away. The mother tiger had flanked them. Moving with impossible silence through the powder, she had ambushed Cole from the side. The tiger did not go for a lethal bite to the neck. Instead, in a display of terrifying, calculated precision, she clamped her massive jaws around Cole's right forearm, the arm holding his rifle, and clamped down. The sickening crunch of bone was audible even over the wind. Cole dropped the weapon, screaming in agony as the tiger dragged him effortlessly into the shadows. "Cole!" Noah yelled, spinning around and firing blindly into the trees. "Let him go, you beast!" The tiger dropped the severely injured man, let out a warning chuff, and melted back into the darkness. She was playing a tactical game. She was protecting the perimeter of the cabin, isolating the threat, and disabling the hunters one by one. Noah was now alone, his partner incapacitated and bleeding heavily in the snow. Panic, combined with the creeping lethargy of the extreme cold, began to take hold of him. He abandoned his cover behind the truck and sprinted madly toward the cabin porch, determined to kick the door down and find sanctuary. Ruth stood up, leveled her Winchester, and aimed squarely at the center of the heavy oak door. "Take one more step, Noah," Ruth said, her voice eerily calm, projecting through the shattered window. "And I will put a .30 caliber hollow point through your chest." Noah froze, his heavy boots on the first step of the porch. He was shivering violently now, his breath coming in ragged, freezing gasps. He looked at the shattered window, then at his screaming partner in the snow, and finally out into the terrifying, absolute darkness of the taiga, where a 400-pound predator was waiting for him to make a mistake. Slowly, his shaking hands opened. His custom-built hunting rifle fell into the snow. "Please," Noah begged, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "Please. We'll freeze to death." Ruth did not let them into the main cabin. She was compassionate, but she wasn't a fool. Holding Noah at gunpoint, she ordered him to drag the weeping, bleeding Cole into the reinforced firewood shed attached to the side of the cabin. She tossed them a heavy first aid trauma kit, 3 thick wool blankets, and a single chemical heat pack. She locked the heavy iron padlock from the outside. It wouldn't be comfortable, and Cole's arm was likely destroyed, but the ambient heat leaking from the cabin's chimney through the shed wall would keep them alive until morning. When Ruth finally stepped back inside and locked her front door, her entire body began to shake. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She walked back to the kitchen table. The cub was beginning to stir, the anesthetic wearing thin. He weakly lifted his large, oversized head, his blue-gray eyes blinking up at her in the dim light of the wood stove. Ruth immediately set to work. She couldn't stitch the wound closed, the infection was too deep, and it needed to drain, but she packed it heavily with sterile gauze soaked in iodine and broad-spectrum antibiotics. She bound the leg tightly with cohesive bandages, ensuring the pressure was firm but not restrictive. "You're going to make it, little fighter," she murmured, stroking the soft fur between the cub's ears. The cub leaned into her touch, letting out a sound that was half purr, half whimper. Ruth walked back to her desk and picked up the satellite phone. It was still connected. "Samuel?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Ruth, thank God." Samuel's voice practically exploded through the speaker. "I heard gunshots. I've been calling the regional magistrate. Captain Pendleton from the Yakutsk Wildlife Task Force is mobilizing a heavy-duty snowcat. They are bringing a medical team. What is your status?" "2 poachers," Ruth said wearily. "One with a crushed arm, courtesy of the mother. They are locked in my woodshed. Their truck is disabled. The cub is stable. Wound is debrided and packed. But Samuel, what is it, Ruth?" Ruth looked out the shattered front window. The blizzard had finally begun to break, the heavy snowfall thinning to reveal the pale, ghostly light of the impending dawn. There, sitting perfectly still in the center of her driveway, was the mother tiger. Her fur was coated in a thick layer of frost, and a dark streak of blood stained her left flank where one of the poacher's bullets had grazed her. She was staring directly at the cabin window. "The mother is still here," Ruth said softly. "She's hurt, and she's not leaving without her son." "Ruth, you cannot open that door," Samuel warned. "She's injured and highly stressed. She will perceive any movement as a threat. You have to wait for Pendleton's team with the tranquilizer darts." Ruth knew Samuel was right. The fragile truce between her and the apex predator was built entirely on the barrier of the cabin walls. For the next 4 hours, Ruth sat in an armchair by the window, the Winchester resting across her lap, watching the mother tiger. The massive cat did not move. She sat like a sentinel carved from orange and black ice, her eyes locked onto the cabin, enduring the agonizing cold through sheer maternal willpower. Just after 8 a.m., the ground began to rumble. A massive, bright orange Haglund snowcat crested the ridge, its heavy tank treads chewing through the deep powder. Behind it, a localized police SUV struggled up the cleared path. The mother tiger stood up, her ears flattening against her skull at the mechanical roar of the approaching vehicles. She let out a final, defiant roar, but she was too exhausted to fight an armored vehicle. As Captain Pendleton's team deployed, a specialized veterinarian leaned out of the snowcat's hatch with a pneumatic dart rifle. Twip, the tranquilizer dart embedded perfectly in the fleshy muscle of the tiger's hindquarter. She swiped at it angrily, took 3 heavy, staggering steps toward the cabin, and then slowly collapsed into the soft snow, fast asleep. The next hour was a blur of calculated chaos. Captain Pendleton and his armed officers secured the woodshed, dragging the heavily frostbitten and defeated poachers out in handcuffs. Cole was immediately loaded onto a stretcher, his arm a mangled mess, while Noah was shoved into the back of the police SUV. Meanwhile, the medical team rushed into Ruth's cabin. They marveled at the clean, efficient job she had done on the cub's leg. They carefully loaded the sleeping cub into a heated transport crate. Outside, 5 men struggled to lift the heavily sedated mother tiger onto a specialized transport sled. Captain Arthur Pendleton, a gruff, heavily bearded man with frost in his eyebrows, walked up the steps of Ruth's porch. He surveyed the shattered window, the bullet holes in the logs, and the bloodstains in the snow. "Dr. Caldwell," Pendleton said, removing his heavy fur hat out of deep respect. "In all my years policing this tundra, I have never seen anything like this. A wild Amur tiger surrendering her cub to a human, and a human holding off an armed poaching syndicate to protect them." Ruth pulled her parka tighter around her shoulders, looking past the captain to where the medical team was securing the mother and her cub in the back of the heated snowcat. "She didn't surrender to me, Captain," Ruth corrected him gently, her breath pluming in the freezing morning air. She recognized that the rules of the wild had failed them. She just needed a bridge to cross over into a different kind of survival. "I just happened to be the one standing at the door." Pendleton nodded slowly. "We're taking them to the rehabilitation sanctuary in Vladivostok. The vets say the cub's leg will heal. They'll be kept together. When they are strong enough, we'll return them to the deep taiga, far away from here." "Good," Ruth said softly, a profound sense of peace finally settling over her exhausted mind. "Keep them safe." As the heavy engines of the convoy revved and began their slow descent back down the mountain, Ruth stood on her porch and watched them disappear into the vast, white expanse of the Siberian wilderness. The taiga was a brutal, unforgiving place, but as she turned back to her battered cabin, she knew that even in the coldest place on earth, the fire of a mother's love and the unexpected warmth of human compassion could keep the darkest forces at bay. This incredible convergence of predator and human highlights a profound truth. The maternal instinct transcends species, driving a desperate mother to cross the boundaries of the natural world to save her young. Ruth's courage and empathy reveal that even in the harshest, most unforgiving environments on Earth, a single act of cross-species compassion can rewrite the rules of survival and bridge the terrifying gap between humanity and the wild.